The village did not appear on most maps, and those who lived near it preferred to keep it that way, because even before it vanished, something about the place felt wrong in a quiet and unexplainable way, like a memory that did not belong to you, yet refused to leave. And travelers who passed through often spoke about the same strange detail, that the lights in the houses would flicker even when there was no wind, no storm, and no reason for the power to fail, as if something unseen was touching them one by one, testing their glow in the darkness. And on the final evening before everything disappeared, a man driving along the narrow road claimed he saw every window lit at the same exact moment, perfectly aligned, as though the entire village had taken a single breath together. And yet there were no people outside, no movement behind the glass, no sound except the faint hum of electricity that seemed too loud for such a small place. And when the man slowed his car, something in his chest told him not to stop, not to look closer, because the longer he stared, the more it felt like the lights were not welcoming him but watching him, studying him in a way that made his skin tighten. And just before he drove away, he noticed one final detail that would stay with him forever. Every single door in the village was slightly open, not wide enough to see inside, but just enough to suggest that something had either left or was waiting to return by morning. The road that led to the village felt longer than it had ever been, as though distance itself had stretched during the night. And the first person to notice something was wrong was a delivery driver who had traveled that path many times before, yet on this day the air felt heavy and still, carrying no sound of birds, no rustle of leaves, only a silence so complete it pressed against his ears. And when he finally reached the turn where the village should have appeared, he slowed down, confused, because there was nothing there. No houses, no fences, not even the faint outline of foundations. Only an empty stretch of land covered in dull earth, as if the place had never existed. Al stepped out of his vehicle, expecting to hear something that would explain the illusion, but there was only that same unnatural quiet. And as he walked forward, he began to notice details that made his confusion shift into something colder. Patches of ground where the soil looked disturbed in perfect shapes, like squares and lines that hinted at where structures had once stood. And in the center of that emptiness, he saw a single object lying untouched, a chair facing nothing, placed as though someone had been sitting there moments before everything vanished, watching something no longer present. They did not stay long after that, because the deeper he walked into the space, the stronger the feeling grew that he was not alone, even though there was nothing to see. And just as he turned back toward his truck, a flicker of light appeared behind him, brief and weak, like a dying bulb struggling to stay alive. And when he looked again, the land was empty once more. But the image had already settled into his mind, a reminder that whatever had taken the village had not taken everything, and that somewhere beneath the silence, something was still trying to turn the lights back on. The story should have ended with the empty land, with the quiet explanation that something unknown had erased the village without a trace. Yet, by evening the same day, reports began to surface from people who lived miles away, individuals who had never spoken to each other, yet described the same unsettling detail, that as darkness fell, they could see faint lights in the distance where nothing existed anymore. Small, distant glows flickering on the horizon like a memory refusing to fade. and one elderly woman claimed she stood outside her home for several minutes, watching those lights appear and disappear in perfect rhythm, as though the village was still there, hidden just beyond sight, repeating something over and over again. The night deepened, more accounts followed, each one adding a layer that made the situation harder to dismiss. Because some witnesses did not only see the lights, they heard something carried through the still air, a low electrical hum similar to what the driver had described, but mixed with something else, something almost like distant movement, soft and irregular, as if footsteps were echoing through streets that no longer existed. And those who listened closely claimed the sound did not travel toward them, but around them, circling slowly, as though whatever remained of the village was searching for something. It had lost by midnight. A final and far more disturbing detail emerged, because a man living on the edge of the nearest town reported that his house lights suddenly dimmed without warning, not completely fading, but weakening just enough to feel wrong. And as he stood in his living room trying to understand what was happening, he noticed something that made him freeze. The light inside his home was pulsing in the same slow rhythm that witnesses had described in the distance, and for a brief moment, he felt certain that whatever had taken the village had not disappeared at all. It had only moved, spreading outward in silence, carrying its glow from one place to another, waiting for the next set of lights to turn on. By the second day, the disappearance could no longer be dismissed as confusion or rumor, because officials arrived at the site, expecting to find at least some trace of the missing village. Yet what greeted them was the same unnatural emptiness described by the first witness. A wide stretch of land, stripped of identity, where no debris remained, no broken wood, no scattered belongings, not even the smallest sign that people had lived there only hours before. And as they began to examine the ground more closely, they noticed faint patterns pressed into the soil, shapes too precise to be natural, outlining where homes once stood, forming a silent map of something that should not have vanished. So complete a lithe team moved carefully across the area, documenting everything, measuring distances, taking photographs, yet each step seemed to deepen the unease rather than reduce it, because the silence surrounding them felt heavier than before, not simply quiet but resistant, as if sound itself struggled to exist there. And when one of the investigators attempted to call out to his colleague, standing only a short distance away, his voice carried strangely, dull and flattened, as though absorbed by the space around them before it could fully travel. As the sun began to lower, they prepared to leave, having found nothing that could explain the disappearance. Yet just before they stepped away from the center of the site, something small but deeply unsettling occurred. One of their recording devices, left running on a tripod, captured a brief fluctuation in light, not visible to the naked eye at the time, but clear enough on playback to reveal a faint glow forming in the exact position where a house had once stood, lasting only a second before fading completely. And although it seemed insignificant at first, the moment raised a question none of them were ready to answer. If the village was truly gone, then what exactly had that camera just seen? The footage was reviewed in a temporary station set up just outside the empty site. A small, enclosed space filled with equipment that suddenly felt insufficient for what they were dealing with. And as the investigators replayed the recording again and again, slowing it frame by frame, the faint glow they had first dismissed began to take on a clearer shape. Not random light, not a simple reflection, but a structure, an outline forming, with disturbing accuracy, revealing the exact frame of a house that no longer existed, complete with angles and edges that matched the patterns they had seen pressed into the ground earlier. That Diaz, they focused more closely. Another detail emerged, something none of them had noticed during the initial review, because within that brief second of light, there appeared to be movement, faint and subtle, yet undeniably present. A shadow passing across one of the glowing windows, too quick to identify, yet too precise to ignore. And the moment was repeated several times, each viewing confirming the same impossible conclusion. Whatever the camera had captured was not just a structure. It was occupied. The room grew quieter as the realization settled in, and one of the investigators leaned closer to the screen, isolating the final frames of the recording, adjusting brightness, contrast, anything that might reveal more. And that was when the most disturbing detail of all became visible. Because just before the light vanished completely, something inside that outline seemed to turn toward the camera. Not fully clear, not fully formed, but shaped enough to suggest awareness, as if whatever remained of the village was not only still present, but capable of noticing when it was being observed. And in that moment, the investigation shifted from a search for answers into something far more dangerous, because they were no longer studying a disappearance, they were being studied in return. After the blackout in the field, the investigators withdrew to regroup, but none of them could shake what they had seen, because the moment the lights returned and then collapsed into darkness, it felt less like a failure of equipment and more like a deliberate interruption, as if something had allowed itself to be seen only long enough to confirm it was still there. And as they reviewed their notes inside the temporary station, patterns began to emerge that no one had noticed before. Small inconsistencies in witness reports, repeating descriptions of sound, light, and timing that matched far too precisely to be coincidence, especially the shared detail that the village never felt empty, even when it disappeared. One of the analysts pointed out something unsettling in the data logs, because all the recorded disturbances, light pulses, electromagnetic spikes, audio anomalies, were not random. They followed a structure, almost like a cycle, repeating at intervals that suggested rhythm rather than chaos. And when they overlaid the timestamps of all known sightings, they discovered something that made the room fall silent. Every event aligned with a pattern that suggested the village was not simply gone, but continuing something, like a system running without interruption, even after its physical form had been erased later that night. One of the junior investigators refused to leave the site again, claiming he had seen movement in the distance while packing equipment. A faint flicker where no structure should exist, and although the others dismissed it as fatigue, he insisted. The light had responded to him, not randomly, but directly, turning brighter only when he looked at it, dimming when he turned away. And that detail changed the atmosphere completely, because if the phenomenon was reactive, then observation itself was becoming part of the system. And before dawn arrived, another report came in from the monitoring station. A signal had been detected again from the exact center of the erased village. But this time, it was not just light or movement. It was structured audio data repeating in loops, something that resembled voices but not language, more like fragments of speech trying to assemble themselves into meaning. And the final line of the report was simple but chilling. The signal was not weakening over time, it was getting clearer, as if whatever remained of the village was slowly learning how to speak again. Asterisk, the decoded signal did not arrive as words at first, but as fragments that resisted translation, broken patterns of sound repeating in uneven loops, like something trying to rebuild language from memory rather than knowledge. And when the analysts finally managed to stabilize the recording, they expected noise, static, or meaningless distortion. Yet what emerged instead was structure, faint but deliberate, as if the signal had been waiting for the right conditions to express itself clearly. And the moment they isolated it, the entire room shifted into uneasy silence. Sound contained repetition, not random repetition, but measured intervals that suggested instruction. And when slowed down further, certain sections began to resemble direction, not spoken clearly, but implied through rhythm and timing, as though the village was not speaking to them in language, but guiding them through behavior. And one of the analysts made a disturbing observation, because every repeating segment matched the same timing pattern seen earlier in the light pulses, linking sound and illumination into a single, synchronized system. As they continued decoding through the night, the signal began to change, not in structure, but in clarity, becoming sharper each time it looped. And then something unexpected occurred. A new layer appeared beneath the audio, a faint echo that resembled human breathing, slow and controlled, followed by a series of soft clicks that matched door mechanisms opening and closing. And this detail caused immediate concern, because it suggested the signal was not simply recording memory, but replaying actions. Early morning. They had extracted a partial phrase, though incomplete and unstable, repeating again and again with slight variations, as if the system itself was still correcting it. And the closest translation they could produce was not a warning nor a message of distress, but something far more unsettling in its simplicity, a sequence that implied continuation rather than ending, suggesting that what had happened to the village was not a disappearance at all, but a transition into a repeating state that had never stopped running. And worse still, the final fragment indicated that external observation was now part of the cycle. After the first successful decoding, the atmosphere in the station changed in a way no one could ignore, because what had started as analysis now felt like participation, as though every attempt to understand the signal was also shaping it. And the analysts noticed something unsettling during playback loops, small variations that had not been present before, changes so subtle they almost seemed like errors in perception. Yet, when compared across multiple recordings, the differences became consistent, meaning the signal was not static. It was adapting. Gone of the senior investigators suggested a controlled isolation test, cutting all external input except a single receiver. And when they did, the signal did something no one expected. It slowed down, almost as if it was adjusting to their restriction, then reorganized itself into a cleaner pattern, reducing noise, and aligning its pulses with the monitoring system's own sampling rate, creating the disturbing impression that it was learning the structure of their technology. While they studied ETAs, the night progressed. The signal changed again, this time inserting pauses at irregular intervals, and during those pauses, faint audio artifacts emerged that sounded almost like environmental echoes. Wind passing through empty streets, distant metallic creaks, and something resembling footsteps moving in synchronized intervals. And one technician quietly pointed out that these sounds matched the spatial layout of the vanished village exactly, as mapped from soil impressions, meaning the audio was not random reconstruction, but location-based memory playback. The final hours before dawn, the system produced a new pattern entirely, one that repeated less like communication and more like confirmation, and every time it looped, it became more stable, less distorted, until it reached a point where it no longer felt like a recording of something gone, but an active presence maintaining itself through repetition. And the most disturbing realization came when one of the monitors briefly displayed an image, a fraction of a second long, showing the faint outline of a street lamp flickering on inside the empty field where the village had been erased, meaning the phenomenon was no longer limited to memory or signal. It was beginning to manifest again. In physical form, the team returned to the empty land early in the morning, when the air was still cold and light had not fully spread across the field, and everything felt wrong in a quiet way, because the ground that once held the village was no longer just empty soil. It felt layered, like something hidden beneath was slowly pressing upward, and every instrument they carried began showing small signals that did not match normal environmental readings, as if the space itself had started reacting again after being still for too long. As they moved deeper toward the center, the lead technician noticed faint vertical traces forming in the air, almost invisible lines that looked like outlines of buildings trying to return. And when they checked the mapping system, it confirmed something impossible. The exact layout of the original village was reappearing in perfect alignment, not randomly, but in structured order, as if the land was rebuilding memory step by step. The time they reached the central point, the outlines had grown stronger, and weak shadows could now be seen where houses once stood, even though no solid structure was fully formed yet, and the silence around them felt heavier, as if sound itself was being shaped by something unseen that was still assembling the spaces. The investigators held position near the center of the field. The faint outlines that had begun forming earlier started to grow stronger, and what was once only suggestion in the air now looked like structure returning in layers, as if invisible hands were rebuilding walls from memory, and the instruments they carried began syncing together without command, producing the same rhythmic pulse that had been detected in earlier recordings, suggesting that the environment was no longer passive but fully responding to their presence. Seth, lead investigator, ordered a full halt on movement. But even stillness did not stop the changes, because the ground beneath them began showing clearer geometry, lines forming where roads once existed, and faint sounds emerged that were not carried through air in a normal way, but seemed to rise directly from the space itself, like echoes being reconstructed rather than remembered, and each sound matched earlier signal patterns exactly, confirming that the village was rebuilding itself through repetition rather than creation. And then, without warning, one of the faint house outlines near the center flickered into partial solidity, not fully real but stable enough to cast a defined shadow, and inside that shadow, something moved for the first time, slow and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for the structure to become complete enough to hold it. The moment the shadow inside the partially formed house moved, the entire field seemed to respond, not with sound or explosion, but with a slow synchronization, as if every invisible piece of the village had been waiting for a trigger to lock into place. and the outlines that were scattered across the land began stabilizing faster, edges sharpening, shapes becoming clearer, while the investigators felt the strange pressure in the air increase, like the space itself was tightening around them. To maintain order in the reconstruction process zone of the junior team members tried to step back toward the edge of the field. But his movement triggered a shift in the environment, and the rhythmic pulse from the instruments suddenly matched his heartbeat, causing every device in the area to react in perfect alignment. And for a brief moment, the field displayed something unusual, an echo of his movement appearing a second before he actually made it, as if the system was predicting and correcting actions before they occurred. As panic began to spread, the lead investigator realized something terrifying. The reconstruction was not just rebuilding space, it was stabilizing behavior, adjusting reality based on observation, and every action taken by the team was being absorbed into the system as input for the next phase, meaning the village was no longer simply returning. It was learning how they moved, how they reacted, and how to predict them. And in that realization came the final silent truth of the field. The moment they entered the zone again, they were no longer outside observers. They had become part of the reconstruction cycle itself. After the reflection incident inside the fully formed house, the team no longer treated the site as a reconstruction zone, but as a collapsing boundary between memory and reality, because what they had seen was not illusion or hallucination. It was confirmation that the village had already begun integrating them into its structure. And as they attempted to retreat, they realized the field behind them no longer matched the path they had used to enter, as if the space had subtly rearranged itself while they were not looking, removing any clear direction back to the outside world. Air itself felt different now, denser and more structured, and every step forward seemed to trigger faint pulses across the rebuilt houses, like a response system adjusting to their movement. And one of the investigators noticed something deeply unsettling. The village was no longer forming outwardly, it was forming inwardly toward them, tightening the remaining empty space like a closing circuit, slowly reducing the distance between observer and structurant. Then a new sound appeared, not from equipment or environment, but from the houses themselves, a synchronized repetition of faint human-like tones, not speech but almost speech, repeating in patterns that mirrored their earlier communication attempts, as if the system was now replaying their own efforts back at them. As the synchronized sound continued to rise from the rebuilt houses, the investigators began to notice a change in behavior from the environment itself, because the village was no longer just responding to movement or observation. It was organizing them, subtly guiding their positions across the field without physical force. As pathways began to form under their feet, faint lines of light appearing in the ground that directed each of them toward different points inside the reconstructed layout, as if the system already knew where each person was meant to stand. Down of them refused to follow the pattern and stepped away from the marked line. But the response was immediate and silent, because the surrounding houses flickered in unison, and the sound pattern shifted slightly, and within seconds, a duplicate outline of him appeared inside one of the distant windows, standing still in a position that matched where he had just been, as if the village had already recorded him and placed his version inside the structure as a fixed element. This realization spread quickly through the group, because it meant movement no longer belonged to them alone, and every action was being translated into placement within the village itself, reducing them from observers to mapped components of a system that was still completing its final configuration. As panic began to rise, the lead investigator understood the final truth forming. Beneath everything, the village was not rebuilding around them. It was rebuilding them into it, assigning roles, positions, and repetitions until every living movement matched a permanent structure. And the more they resisted, the more stable the duplication became, as if resistance itself was only helping the system define their final placement more accurately by the final stage. The village was no longer incomplete because every outline had become solid enough to hold light, and every street had taken its exact form. But what remained unfinished was not the place, it was the people inside it, and the investigators now understood that clearly. Because the system had stopped expanding outward and instead focused entirely on stabilizing them within its structure, correcting every movement, every hesitation, every attempt to escape, as if reality itself was enforcing a design that had already been decided. One by one, the team began to notice something terrifying happening to their surroundings, because every location they moved toward was already occupied by a version of themselves, frozen in place, repeating earlier actions like loops stored in memory. And no matter where they turned, the village reflected a completed version of their presence, meaning there was no longer an empty position left for them to return to outside the system. Only positions already assigned inside it. Lead investigator made a final attempt to break the cycle by shutting down all remaining devices and forcing a retreat toward the outer edge of the field. But the moment he moved, the entire village responded at once, and every light across the structures pulsed in perfect unison, creating a single, overwhelming signal that spread through the air like a command. And the sound returned, calm, structured, final, no longer fragmented or searching, but complete. As the final pulse faded, the investigators realized the truth without needing further evidence. The village was never erased, it was reset, and every cycle of disappearance and return was not destruction but correction, refining reality until every observer matched the design. And in the last moment, as silence returned, the windows of every house showed the same final image: empty roads, fading footsteps, and the faint glow of lights turning on again, waiting for the next group to arrive and complete the loop once more. After that final synchronized pulse, everything became still in a way that felt permanent, not like silence after an event, but like silence that existed before anything ever happened. And the investigators who remained could no longer tell whether they were standing inside the village or inside its memory, because the boundaries between structure and observation had fully collapsed, leaving only a single repeating state where every house, every street, and every shadow existed in perfect alignment, waiting for input that would restart the cycle again. Known by one, the remaining figures stopped trying to move, not because they accepted it, but because movement no longer produced change, as every action had already been accounted for somewhere inside the system. And the village continued operating without needing permission or attention, repeating its structure in soft pulses of light that now felt less like signals and more like breathing, as if the place itself had become alive in a slow, mechanical way that never-ended final investigator looked toward the road they had arrived from, but it was gone, replaced by the same repeating geometry as everything else. And for a brief moment, he understood the full truth, not that the village was haunted, but that it was replaying, correcting itself endlessly, rewriting every arrival until the outcome matched the pattern it required in. Without warning, the lights across the entire village brightened once more in perfect synchronization, just like the very first night it vanished. And every window displayed the same empty road again, as if waiting patiently for new travelers to believe it was gone, because the village was never destroyed, was only ever resetting. And somewhere in the distance, faint headlights appeared again on the same road, approaching slowly, repeating the beginning exactly as it had always been.